So let's kick off immediately. This is a fire chat, and it's also going to be quick fire, Tim, right? So we start immediately. Before I occupy Tim too much, I remind you that you also can ask questions, not by raising your hand, but scanning there, and so I get your questions on the sliders. So if you have questions, please put them now. Tim, I guess we have to start with the already infamous 28-point plan. Yes. And once again, there seems like the Europeans are caught completely blindsided by this. So let's do a little thought experiment now. A very stressed Ursula, a very stressed Friedrich, a very stressed Emmanuel, maybe even a very stressed Gitanas suddenly have to call you and say, Tim, like, you know, we just saw this 28-point plan. What should a European position be? What would you tell them?
So I don't know. I think I understand better the Ukrainian position. Of course, the Ukrainian public is rejecting it out front as a surrender plan by Russians and Americans this time. Fortunately or unfortunately, or very surprisingly, it looks like it is much more real than in previous times. That's what I sense from Kyiv right now, from the way the pressure is applied on Kyiv. Now, some of this, you know, if it's an opening bid, opening bids are always terrible, so you can work with this. But if it's an ultimatum that it is you know, take it or leave it, then I think we all in Europe are in a very treacherous, very awful, tragic position. So I think that would be my question. I would say, listen, we need to figure out if it's a negotiation or if it's an ultimatum. If it's an ultimatum, our strategy would be to get together behind Ukraine, say no, and continue to strengthen support. If it is a bargaining position, then we need to ensure sovereignty, independence, and real ability of Ukraine to defend itself with guarantees. So basically, these are the three questions.
But okay, but is Europe united enough and strong enough, and also Ukraine strong enough to actually just say no? To just walk away and say no?
Well, so I'm an economist, I'm a game theorist. I'm thinking in terms of counterfactual. So Ukraine now, I mean, it's great. We can make all the statements. The question is what kind of structures we can put in place to protect Ukraine or unite Europe. And, you know, Ukraine is, like, there is a question of fiscal support for Ukraine, even Q1, Q2. So there's a question of funding. There's a question of domestic political crisis caused by the recent corruption scandal. There's a question of the pressure from the United States. If the pressure from the United States, as I hear, is going to be extreme to the extent that they are willing to cut off intelligence, not allow Europeans to buy weapons for Ukraine, and let's say deny codes for Patriots, missiles and interceptors and all kinds of things, then the counterfactual for Ukraine is really, really tough. And we need all the support, political, diplomatic and financial, in order for that scenario not to realize. So it depends on how hard President Trump is going to drive this deal and want to get it so that he can move on his news cycle that he's trying to get out of. So I think that's is Europe united? Yeah, I mean, if this scenario is that Ukraine is going to collapse and with help of the United States, that Europe better be united.
So you mentioned the economic split. How important is it that the EU agree in December on a reparations loan for Ukraine?
So it is important. Ukraine faces a gap of about, indeed, as earlier today, I think in the second panel we discussed it, of about $50 billion dollars or euros. And it can be covered by depletion of the central bank reserves and some bilateral help. But that's going to generate a credibility issue. So if the central bank, so this crisis in terms of fundamentals, Ukraine will withstand. but will it be a trigger of confidence in the economy? So I think that's an unknown. It is better to avoid it.
You mentioned, of course, the corruption scandal, and you have been very vocal about that. You stepped away from the advisory board of Energoatom. How badly has this damaged Kiev, do you think?
I actually think it's an opportunity for President Zelensky and also for the government to, to demonstrate commitment to cleaning up issues. There are obviously issues, but I've seen how the Prime Minister has acted, and it's surprisingly more proactive than usual. So, for example, to give a specific example, the CEO of another energy company, there is a competition, and competition has selected a final winner according to international practices. And Prime Minister stepped in and said, no, we're going to cancel the competition. And the reason is that the person who was the final candidate, finalist, was actually serving some time ago for a short period of time as an advisor to the former Minister of Energy who is implicated in this scandal. So the government right now is moving beyond trying to work with the criminal investigation, but trying to isolate completely and get rid of anyone who is somehow related to people who were involved. So that's new for Ukraine, and I think that's the right way. They are resetting all energy company leadership and governance. I would rather have a little bit more, discriminatory approach, but that's fine. So the government is taking it very, very seriously. Now that generated a domestic political crisis, which with opposition forcing or demanding, and some of the supporters of President Zelensky within his own party demanding that the head of the office of the president, who has coincidentally today birthday, by the way, so you can send them a message on social media, hopefully with support or not, depending on your political stand. But he's not implicated in the case, but the entire case domestically, politically, is now focused on getting him out of the office. So there is really, like, the elections have started in Ukraine. Basically, you can say there is a war environment, there are no elections, but you cannot stop the politics, The politics is there, and I've talked to a number of people in military and among the opposition over the last 48 hours, and they were saying, listen, there's no problem with the president, we just want the leadership around the president to, clear, and so that new people can come in, including us. So there's basically a political process there, which I think is destabilizing, but I think Zelensky is handling it well, actually.
I think I have to ask the direct question. Should Mr. Yermak go?
No, I don't think right now. So basically, I think that depends a lot on what is truly happening with the peace process. If there is a serious peace process, all of that has to be bundled. So Zelensky will have to get support from Europe to be able to get some kind of a bargaining position. Otherwise, he's on his own. Once he have that, and there is some bundle, some sacrifices will have to be made in any way. I'm not arguing the Trump's line that Ukraine has to give up, but something will be unpleasant anyway. And so he needs domestic support to be able to sell this deal, not sell, to convince the public or the parliament to vote for something. And that where the parliament will come in and say, oh, we want some political changes. That's basically how it's going to work. He needs a coalition there, and he will have to, trade something politically. And so if I were him, and I'm not him, so I don't know, but if I were him, I would hold off on any kind of moves on domestic politics until I understand what is happening with the grand game that Russia is playing and the US maybe is playing this week, and then bundle it together as a package.
So that's one of the questions here I got, that do you think Europe, along with Ukraine, will need to compromise any of its security stance in order to facilitate a peace deal?
Some compromise has to be made.
What?
And this compromise will be either to give some security to Ukraine or continue to finance Ukraine. So Ukraine has an alternative path forward, and I think this is basically the most important strategic move which is not being discussed. About a year ago, a little bit later, when the Trump administration made it very clear that the entire NATO discussion is basically completely off the table regardless of what Russia does. President Zelensky has changed the strategy on military. Instead of trying to build security by becoming a part or trying to argue or getting closer to NATO, Ukraine has and asking for more weapons, including from the United States. That process continues, but basically Ukraine moved 100% all of its energy into developing a domestic military base. We have seen that the drones, the deep strikes, the scalability has improved. We also have seen already cruise missiles. We're months away from ballistic missiles development. Prototypes are being tested. And they are a fraction of cost in Europe, and maybe even cheaper than in Russia, substantively cheaper. So that means that and also recent incursions in Poland and elsewhere demonstrated that the capabilities which are required in this war, NATO might have some capabilities, but not all. Intercepting 1,000 drones, that's a capability currently NATO doesn't have, or it would be extremely expensive to use it with the existing platforms. And you cannot do it in a peacetime country. You cannot go to Poland and mobilize 4,000 people to become operators of small drone interceptors because it's not wartime. You simply don't have the mass of businesses and military to be able to operate it non-stop. So that capability is absent. And so Ukraine can build up those capabilities, and they're cheap, so very asymmetric, very structural, very AI-driven or new tech-driven. Very cheap, actually. And I think what we are seeing now, in the last year, I've seen 1 unicorn in Ukraine in finance and about 10 in military, in defense tech. They are there. They are being valued right now at over $1 billion. A lot of, there are Ukrainian whales right now, which are now being valued at substantive. So that's also a driver of the economy. And Ukraine is on the verge of basically having the defense base, which can protect itself. The real question right now is interceptors. Can we intercept? Can we have something equivalent to what the West has in terms of interception and air defense? But we are getting there. So I think Ukraine can go forward with this model. And also I cynically, Machiavellianly, in a Machiavellian way, think that this is the reason that the peace process became much more realistic, because Ukraine is just really on the verge of building joint ventures with Europe to give this technology also to Europe and benefit from this. So suddenly, if nothing happens in 6 to 12 months, Europe will have the Ukrainian technology to resist Russia and will have these capabilities NATO doesn't currently have. That's not something Russia likes. It's in Russia's interest for that capability, basically for the politics to say, oh, there's no war anymore. It has been settled. Forget about joint venture budget. Today we talked about 5% commitment. Maybe go back and put it into social, expenditure. So let's not get the capabilities that we can defend against Russia. I think that's a blind spot, actually, on everything which is happening, but it's in the interest of Russia right now to sort of have everyone come down and say, listen, no war anymore, some process is in place, okay?
But compromise obviously means that Ukraine has to bite the bullet on some things. And probably, looking from a 28-point plan, it could be some land will be lost, your Ukrainian military will be capped, and you have to say no to NATO. Is any of those acceptable?
So, NATO, you can say whatever you want on NATO, but this all can be changed, given there is a political will in NATO, okay? So that, I think, is very difficult to enforce in practical terms, Of course, there will be a risk if something gets codified in the constitution, then uncodifying it would create a trigger for Putin, Mr. Putin, or whoever to invade again. So that needs to be triggered. But I don't think, so that I don't know how to think about properly. On land, basically the way everyone is thinking about land right now around contact line is that you have to have a killer zone about 100 kilometers both ways. And that's probably how it will be, that, it will be monitored with drones and robots. And right now, the problem was sort of killer, Ukraine is moving and Russia is also moving into this killer zone. The idea of the killer zone that you're training AI, let's say, to hit tanks. But then they don't move with tanks, they move with trucks. Then you train AI on killing trucks. But then they start moving with motorcycles, with bikes, crawling, pretending they are a horse, and something like that. So that you keep retraining your AI, and at some point you say, I'm just going to train AI to kill everything which moves, instead of training for specific type of vehicle or objective. And so now you create areas where you deny the capability to move anything in that area, and basically the doctrine is, if there's sufficient movement, you kill it. So that's probably how it's going to be in the contact line. So we can discuss whatever we want about specific cities and villages in the area, but in realistic terms, these are going to be zones in which if something moves substantively, the other side freaks out. So you can package it politically differently, but I think there's a little bit more specific discussion on where this buffer zone will happen. And
We've talked about the difficult state of the Ukrainian economy. We're talking about that Europe have problems financing, but let's talk a bit about the Russian economy. And you're an economist, and many are also sensing that this is a very stressed economy. How do you judge the state of the Russian economy and its capability to sustain itself?
So clearly it's a very stressed economy, with 40% of its budget being pushed towards national security and the war effort. It is the economy in which it has decided to waste or invest $1 trillion over the last several years, not into innovation or AI or education, but into gaining, 2,000 square kilometers. So I guess that's their preference. But, there's also a joke among economists that out of the last 3 financial crises, we have predicted 8. So, the conditions structural conditions for that economy to go into crisis are there, in particular credit bubble and financing of the war and non-productive use of economy and suppression of talent development. But what is a trigger? So you have to have a credibility trigger. There has to be either a macro shock or some kind of Wagner event or something else which will be substantive enough that people will start losing trust in the ability of the Kremlin to maintain or to keep economies steady. Can Europe, and I think that was the question we were discussing, generate and...
Can they trigger that? Can the West trigger this?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a million of tools you can do that, from cyber attacks on Russian ability to pay pensions to, denying liquidity through financial system, or targeting some of the networks of intermediaries, who are doing some sleazy things in Europe and elsewhere. You can generate credibility crisis, or just like the trust and the ability to continue to operate. But is there a political will to do that? Well, in principle, you can arrest all Russians who are somehow related to Russia, doing whatever they do in Europe, and confiscate their assets. I mean, there are tons of tools you can. They are harsh. Some of them are non-democratic. Do you have those tools? Absolutely. Will you use them? I don't think so, no. Because that requires more extreme conditions and some incursion in some...
So basically what you're saying is, so you don't think that the West has the political will to really punish Russia?
That's exactly what I think. I think the tools are there and have been there throughout the entire... this in many sense, it's travesty. Today we hear, the president here speaks that the Lukoil, sanctions are great and fundamental and shows an alignment, but it's year number 4. I mean, we could have imposed those sanctions in year number 1, and there are tons of other things we could have done in year number 1. There hasn't been a political will to do that. So in part, people died because there's not enough resolution in political leadership around the world. That's how democracies operate.
Tim, I see the clock is ticking. We have 1 minute left. And I wanted, because you mentioned elections, and I'm always, I'm following you on Twitter, and you used to be the minister yourself. Do I sense that maybe you want to go back into politics?
Yeah, so I get that question occasionally. The answer is no. So basically, everyone in my position would say no, regardless of what they think. So let's be honest about that. But basically, I only served as a minister for 6 months, okay? I did a land market reform. I burned my public reputation because oligarchs counterattacked me. I didn't really enjoy it. My family didn't really enjoy it. I think until we have proper political parties in Ukraine which can provide me support, I do not have the leverage to be able to be efficient in an executive. But I also think what Ukraine needs is a lot of educated new leaders, and that's why I went to build the Kyiv School of Economics, and now we have 2,000 students, up to from 20. You know, when I start, I think we need to get to 20,000, and then Ukraine will change, and then there will be no scandals on corruption if we actually educate new generations. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and give up for the future Finance Minister of Ukraine.